Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on Meet the Press yesterday morning with plenty to say about Moody's U.S. credit downgrade and Walmart's appetite for tariffs. Eamon Javers is here. He's been covering all of this in a very busy weekend. Good morning, Eamon.
Hey there, Becky. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent blamed Biden-era government spending for Moody's decision to downgrade U.S. debt on Friday. On NBC's Meet the Press on Sunday, Bessent said the downgrade reflects government behavior in the past.
Moody's is a lagging indicator. I think that's what everyone thinks of credit agencies. Larry Summers and I don't agree on everything, but he said that when they downgraded the U.S. in 2011. So it's a lagging indicator.
Bessent also minimized Walmart's decision to raise prices due to President Trump's tariffs this week, arguing that the retailer is absorbing some of the costs which are not being passed on to American voters.
I was on the phone with Doug McMillon, the CEO of Walmart, yesterday, and Walmart is, in fact, going to, as you describe it, eat some of the tariffs.
And on other topics, Bessent said that neither side had backed down in the tariff standoff with China because the situation was unsustainable for both sides in the end. And he defended President Trump accepting a new luxury jet from the government of Qatar because it is a gift to the U.S. government, not to Trump personally. Guys, back over to you.
Okay, Eamon, a lot to go through with this. Maybe we start on the Moody's downgrade. Scott Bessent is right. This is not something that's happened in the last 100 days. However, he said this was the Biden administration. Moody's says this was more than the Biden administration. Obviously, the deficit went up substantially under the Biden administration, but it did under the Trump administration before that, too, the first Trump administration. I think what's key here, and probably the timing with Moody's, has to do with whether or not Congress is going to take action and start to cut into that deficit, or whether they're going to continue to expand it over several years before any of those cuts really take place.
Yeah, I mean, you heard Bessent there saying that it's a lagging indicator looking backward, but also they're looking forward at this idea of whether or not there's any kind of deficit relief coming from Congress, and there doesn't seem to be, right? I mean, both parties have struggled, no matter what configuration of the government you have, Republican president, Democratic president, Republicans in control of Congress, Democrats in control of Congress. Both parties have struggled to make meaningful cuts in the deficit because when you're an elected official, it's just politically better for you to spend money than to anger people by cutting back benefits and cash that they've been depending on, right? So it's politically really challenging. And even though you've got all this deficit rhetoric in Washington, and we had Doge, making significant cuts through the early part of this year, we don't see any sustained deficit cutting ability up on Capitol Hill over the long term, right? Next couple of years baked into law as opposed to one-off cuts by the executive branch.
I was going to pivot to Walmart just because I'm so fascinated by it. And I don't know if you were reading the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal this morning. Donald Trump goes full Kamala Harris in demanding that the retail giant not raise prices. And then actually they juxtaposed a quote that he had made about her, and then with a quote that he had made, both of which
calling
about
her
Walmart.
a Marxist for trying to put price controls in.
For trying to do this. So the question, I think the real question, even underlying all of that, though, is actually how much of these tariffs companies like a Walmart are going to ultimately eat versus how much the customer is ultimately going to eat.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Andrew, to watch the president of the United States tell Walmart basically how much profit they can make by eating these tariffs, and whether or not Walmart will respond to that. Walmart signaling last week that it was going to have to raise prices. And then you heard Secretary Bessent in that clip that we just played saying, well, what Doug McMillon told me is that they're going to eat some of the tariff costs, right? So they're not going to pass it all on to Walmart shoppers who are, broadly speaking, American voters, right? So this is a fascinating moment where companies have to decide how much of their margin do they want to protect here, and what's the political risk and downside to a company if they anger this president of the United States. And it's a fascinating moment because, I mean, this is a Republican Party that used to be against the idea of government telling business what to do, right? And here we have a very literal case of government telling a business what to do, and that business now has to wrestle with, how do we play this, and what are the downsides for us, either in passing these costs on to our customers or in terms of our margin and eating these costs.
Well, ultimately, look, every retailer, every one of the major retailers, I'm sure the minor retailers too, are trying to do their best to rein in their own expenses. They are trying to do their best to pressure their suppliers to not raise their prices as a result of the inflation that they might be seeing. It's what we saw, and Bessent pointed this out yesterday, it's what we saw in 2018, 19, and 20. All of the major retailers very much tried to absorb as much of the 10% tariff that they possibly could. It really comes down to how big these tariffs are. If you're talking about tariffs that are 20, 30, 40%, it's a lot harder. Some of that will get passed on. It's inevitable that that inflation is not going to be completely eaten by the retailer, because in some cases you're dealing with pretty thin margins, particularly if you're talking about groceries, which traditionally move on a margin of 1 or 2%, maybe 3% at tops. And so many of the products that we're importing, things like bananas, we get almost all of our bananas from Costa Rica. You can't turn around and make them in the United States.
Right.
So, it's going to depend on what is hit, and it's going to depend on how high those tariffs are and how long they last.
And then the business has to factor in this question of, President Trump saying, "I'll be watching you." What does that mean in real terms, and what is the risk there for the business in getting some kind of additional regulatory scrutiny or regulatory burden placed on them because the president decides that they're passing along too much of that cost? And that's sort of, one of those things that you just kind of can't calculate. You have to think about as a business, but you can't really figure out what it is that the president might do to you. And that, I think that's going to make people very uncomfortable.
Who else will be watching is the market and shareholders. So they are caught in a very difficult position because if you don't pass the cost on, your shareholders will sell your stock.
Well, that's why they get paid the big bucks.
But there's sort of another piece to this to me, which is it's not just being caught between the shareholder and the president.
And the customer. You don't want to turn off your customer.
Or the customer. No, but I was going to throw in another sort of version of this, which is depending on how aggressive the president decides to be or not about any particular company. So there's the regulatory regime, which is, he can try to use that arm to do something to Walmart if he so chose. But he can also galvanize Walmart's customer base. In a very interesting way.
Walmart has always protected its customer base. That has been since the creation by Sam Walton. They have always thought about the customer first. How do we get the everyday low prices to the customer? That has been their brand and their absolute mission.
Sure, but I'm saying if the president decides to target a particular company and say this is un-American, what's going on, given actually Walmart's customer base, which actually is probably more 50-50 or maybe even more red than blue or whatever it is,
Doug about this. It is 50-50.
Then it creates a demonstrable issue to the extent that then he can say go over to these guys. The question is who do you go to? I don't know if there's some other retailer that somehow is going to be eating the prices, and so therefore there's cheaper prices.
It's really hard to undercut Walmart. That because they are so big and because they're focused on the bottom line, it's really hard to undercut them. So it's hard to imagine that anybody can come in and say that we're going to eat this, whether that be Amazon, Target, or anybody else. It's next to impossible to undercut them on pricing.
But to Andrew's point, it doesn't have to be necessarily competition on the merits, right? I mean, this is a president of the United States who leads a vast social movement, and he can move those voters and those shoppers, with social media posts, and he could just sort of shift them to another retailer and say, hey, Target is doing the right thing and Walmart's not. Let's all go shop at Target. That would have a measurable effect on Walmart if he did that. We'll see. That's what the question of what does "I'll be watching and so will your customers" mean in real terms.
Yeah. Well, you also had President Trump talking about his difficulties with Tim Cook. I don't know if you guys covered this on Friday.
Yeah, we did. Right.
But again, this was, we don't want you building things in India. We want them built here at home, was his point with that, too. So it's just about any company probably trying to keep their head below the radar at this point.
And is that even economically workable for each of these companies? That's a real question for them to decide.